Good afternoon again, and welcome to the May seminar of the Smart Grid Educational Series. My name is Irfan Ibrahim. I am the founder and CEO of the BitBazaar LLC, and I'm also the energy lead at Cyter Corporation. This Smart Grid Educational Series is a monthly program that brings speakers from a variety of different stakeholder groups in the electric sector, focusing on issues like smart grid, energy efficiency, and sustainability. We look at topics from a business process perspective, a technology perspective, as well as a policy perspective. And so today, to address the policy perspective, we have Chris Villarreal from the California Public Utility Commission, who is a senior analyst there, who will talk a little bit about the Cybersecurity and Data Privacy report that was recently issued from the CPUC. And I would like to just position this presentation and put it a little bit in perspective. So we have in our industry a mix of interests. Some of these interests involve delivering electricity reliably and safely to customers. There are utilities who do that. There are vendors who are providing technologies that enable the delivery of this electricity and the energy services. And then you have academia and research working on the next development that we need to allow for more services to be offered. So in the mix of all of this, there is the Public Utility Commission. Now, the Public Utility Commission works for the public. That's why it's called a Public Utility Commission. So they're constantly seeking ways in which the customer benefits from the investments that are made in the electric sector, just like they do in water and gas and other utilities. It's a very delicate balancing game that the Public Utility Commission has to play. Now, in the United States, the Public Utility Commissions regulate the investor-owned utilities. We have city governments that handle municipals, and then we have boards that manage the co-ops, which are used to deliver electricity primarily in rural and semi-urban areas. But the investor-owned utilities are regulated by the Public Utility Commission. So just think about, it's almost like a linear programming problem that they're facing. One constraint that they have is the cost and what its implication will be on society. On the other hand, they have to regulate an industry that is profit-based, an investor-owned utility. So they have to make sure that whatever policy they make allows for these utilities to remain profitable so that they can provide a return to their shareholders. And then they also have to regulate in a way that does not specify requirements to the point where individual vendors are selected as a result of it, because they want to, again, create a level playing field. So begin to see the complexity. You know, this is one of those unsung heroes. Everyone always talks about and complains, oh, they're very slow, they're not moving at the pace of value and all of this. But just think on a given day what the Public Utility Commission has to do. And then they have to, so they want to create that level playing field for the vendors to compete. And then they have to constantly look to see that is the public getting the best possible deal. And that's why I call it a linear programming or operations research problem, because you have all these constraints and you have to operate in those constraints. So documents like the one that Chris Villarreal is going to talk about help clear a lot of the confusion, a lot of the misunderstandings that individual presentations can make. So the document that he's going to talk about today is kind of like a guidebook. It'll help all of these stakeholder groups do their respective jobs better. So with that, I'd like to welcome Chris Villarreal, who is going to go through this presentation. It will be about 45 minutes long, and then we will continue with the question and answer. So at this point, before we get started, I want to make sure that people are getting the audio, because I see my speaking icon coming on. So can I see in the chat window if people can hear me still clearly? Good. All right, very good. So we're getting plenty of I do's. All right, very good. Thank you. All right, so Chris Villarreal from the California Public Utility Commission, and I will just give you a little heads up on him that he will present. Sometimes he'll be talking from a CPUC perspective, and other times he will make the clarification that I'm now speaking on my behalf. So please follow his preambles, because that will tell you the different tones he may take throughout his presentation. All right, Chris.
All right, thank you, Irfan. I feel like I don't need to have a different presentation anymore. Irfan pretty much gave it for me. I'm Chris Villarreal with the California PUC. As Irfan noted, any opinions expressed here are my own and not those of the Commission. Thank you all for coming here today, and for everyone online for being online today. Irfan, thank you for inviting me again to participate here. So what I'm going to talk about today is a combination of cybersecurity and privacy. The first half is going to be talking about what is the PUC's role and view of cybersecurity. I'm going to be reviewing a white paper that we issued last September, which outlines a viewpoint of cybersecurity from a state regulatory perspective. And then I'm going to finish this presentation talking about privacy and what the Commission has done on privacy. So in my mind, they are logically split. Unfortunately, there's a lot of words here. As is all my presentations is words. My degree is in history, so that's how I communicate best, is through words instead of pictures. So I apologize if anyone gets tired of reading all these words or hearing me just talk about looking at a picture. So I'm going to start talking about cybersecurity. This first slide, I'm just making some basic general opening statements that hopefully everyone can agree with, and as well as is non-controversial, other than perhaps coming from me. There is no 100% guarantee of security. Many times if you go out and talk to the public, they have a very different view of the world than implementers, utilities, and regulators do on this, especially as it involves security. Ensuring security of the utility grid is on par with safety and reliability of the grid. For indeed, you cannot have a safe or reliable operation of the grid if it's not secure. The state PUCs have jurisdiction over electric as well as gas and water utilities. As part of that, we oversee the distribution grid as well as utility investment in the area. So as Irfan noted earlier, our regulation extends to the 3 electric investor utility of California, Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric, as well as SoCal Gas and Southwest Gas. So those are the 5 big investor utilities that we regulate on the gas and the water side. I'm sorry, on the electric and gas side. In addition, we regulate a number of water utilities across the state. And we do a bunch of other things that don't get as much highlight unless something bad happens. As part of that, we oversee utility rate cases, their retail programs, notably energy efficiency and demand response, as well as the retail market itself. On the other hand, we have a regime from FERC and NERC that oversee the bulk power market and the transmission grid. The bulk power market is generally defined, and I'll get into a second, as the wholesale market. I'll use that as a shorthand. NERC SIP, which is the regime over which cybersecurity is enforced over the transmission grid, is a compliance-based system, and that is important, as I'll get into it in a little bit. And as part of compliance, there is a reaction against compliance, and that is the ongoing dialogue across the U.S. on moving to a risk-based approach to cybersecurity. And there are a number of documents out there that evaluate why moving to a risk-based is better, as well as providing some suggestions for how to implement that. So most of this I just went over, but the important thing that I want to point out is the GRC cycles. So about every 3 years, the investor utilities file what are called general rate cases. And those rate cases are how the utility determines how to set the rates and what is their appropriate revenue requirement. California is decoupled, so utility sales don't drive profits. Our GRC cycles are in two phases. The first phase is what's called the revenue requirement phase. That's where the utility tells the commission how much money they expect to need to cover their operations plus profit. And then the phase two determines the rate for how that revenue requirement then gets allocated. Now, the reason why I bring this up is the GRC is where the utilities request funding for their operations, and that does include cybersecurity. So it's in the guise of a GRC proceeding where the utilities make the funding requests for their cybersecurity activities, how much money they think they need over the course of the 3 to 4 years to maintain and implement cybersecurity practices. Now, in the wake of the San Bruno accident, the PUC, as many of you people are probably aware, has been, what's a nice way of putting this? Been in the news a lot over our commitment to safety. And as part of the, in response to San Bruno, we are, of course, refocusing a lot of effort on safety, including most recently PG&Es being required as part of their upcoming GRC to have a safety audit and the results of that safety audit be submitted. Many of you may know, CPUC staff at the Safety Enforcement Division proposed a $2+ billion penalty on PG&E related to the San Bruno accident. And finally, as from the PUC perspective, we are the responsible entity for ensuring that the utility operates in a safe, reliable, and secure manner at a reasonable cost. And at a reasonable cost is one of those to be debated topics. So as the PUC begins to focus on cybersecurity, the PUC must be aware that as the utility moves forward on new infrastructure investment related to smart grid and advanced technologies, we need to ensure that those new technologies have cybersecurity built into it and that cybersecurity is accounted for in their investment strategies. Additionally, we have the added complexity of legacy systems that may not, that are likely not as technologically advanced but cannot be left behind either. If anything, the showdown has showed us that there is a lot of things out there that are connected to things that people and the operators don't know that they are connected. Cybersecurity practices, of course, are more effective when they are built in rather than bolted on later. That becomes important from a cost perspective because it's more cost effective to have cyber built in than to make the investment up front and then have to throw in a costly bolt on later on. Compliance should act as a floor, not a ceiling. Again, with the reliance on NERC STIP being a compliance-based system, usually what you see is people meeting cybersecurity requirements to the compliance and not necessarily moving beyond it. And we need to move beyond this idea of compliance and letting that act as the floor instead of the ceiling for moving forward in cybersecurity. It's also important to remember that at this time, the biggest cybersecurity risk still remains phishing. So while we talk about ensuring that our infrastructure and all the assets that go onto the grid are secure, it's important to remember that people are still the biggest fault for most cyber events. And as part of that, a risk-based approach to cybersecurity offers a greater opportunity for the utility to address needs, risks, threats, and response, and hopefully on a more can respond to them more effectively. But there are two challenges in there interwoven. One is the regulatory challenge to agree to a risk-based approach, and there are jurisdictional challenges, everyone's favorite topic. So the basic jurisdictional issue is federal versus state. The transmission grid, which is generally characterized as transmission above 100 kV, and wholesale markets are under FERC jurisdiction, which has been delegated to NERC. Distribution grid under 100 kV and retail markets are under state and local jurisdiction. So the transmission grid, I would say, is probably far more smarter, if that is grammatically correct, than the distribution grid, which is not really focused or had a need to be very advanced. So less attention is paid to cybersecurity. However, as we start thinking about distributed generation and demand response and energy efficiency and other policies, especially here in California, that are being pushed down the distribution grid needs to become smarter in order to handle all these new investments and technologies being installed on the distribution side. And as part of that comes with increased investment in the technologies from the utilities in order to handle all this. Now the tension becomes, a desire, I'll say, my opinion, of the national efforts to create a top-down approach to cybersecurity by mandating standards runs up against the actual implementation down the distribution grid. Every utility is going to be different. Every utility implementation is going to be different. And it becomes difficult to have a one-size-fits-all approach to cybersecurity mandated from the top down. And as the states move forward on allowing utilities to invest in advanced technologies through advanced meters, addressing distributed generation and encouraging demand response, there are more and more things that are usually under the rubric of the state PUC, but as the definition of bulk power markets begin to evolve, it's not inconceivable to think that the bulk power market could include everything down to the meter and inside the house, which then means as people build things that then fall under the definition of bulk power markets, and now has to meet NERC SIP requirements. And I think that can be a little tricky. Again, the jurisdictional effort around Congress administration and mandate standards throughout the electric grid. There'll be a slide later on, but I'll make the line here. Despite the best efforts and what you may have heard from last week from certain members of Congress, states are working on cybersecurity. We are working on developing standards and implementing best practices on cybersecurity. So whatever report you may have read last week that the federal government is the only one that can handle this, I would say that states are doing this. There are a lot of states working on this, and I'll give you some examples later on. So basically, what do PUCs need to know? And this sort of is the challenging thing, as Irfan noted, is utilities need to go out and do this. This is their requirement, is to provide electricity. And the PUCs are the responsibility for making sure that those are implemented in a safe and reliable manner, in a cost-effective manner. So as PUCs begin to consider developing policies for cybersecurity, what does a PUC need to know? Because there's what the PUC needs to know, and there's what utilities do. And I think those are two different things. The first thing PUCs need to understand is what is the utility cybersecurity process? What are the inputs that go into the process? And just an understanding if the utility even knows what is actually out there on their network. PUCs need to understand that cyber threats and vulnerabilities evolve. The 3+ year DRC cycle may not be able to give the utility flexibility to respond accordingly to fast-moving threats. PUCs need to understand the difference between an IT network and an ICS network. Where are the similarities, where are they different? They also need to make sure that the full organization buys into it, and it's not still relegated to usually the IT department, that everyone inside the business unit is bought into the policy. PUCs need to understand how should standards be used. Should we make them voluntary or should we make them mandatory, and what are the impacts of those choices? What is the business case for cybersecurity? How do we know the money being spent on cybersecurity is effective? How do we know there's the right amount of money? How do we know that just because by sheer luck that one given year there wasn't an incident, that means we can start lowering our barriers, lowering our guard a bit? How do we understand this very evolving and changing nature of this thing? And part of it is through metrics. PUCs also need to get comfortable with not only safety and reliability, but that security is an integral part of the safety and reliability goals of all the utilities. And the last one is understanding the value and variety of risks across the business unit. As we think about a risk-based approach to cybersecurity across the utility, each attribute inside the utility is going to have a different risk. So we think about substation cybersecurity versus AMI cybersecurity versus just the IT network. Each one of them have a separate level of risk that as PUCs start to get more involved in understanding what the utility is doing, making sure that those risks are appropriately valued. All sounds good, right? Well, there is some problems with that from the implementation side. PUC staff is fairly limited on these topics across the country. California is the largest PUC in the country, and we have less than 5 people who spend any portion of their day working on it. And that's usually 4 more people than most other states do. Our expertise is very varied, I'll put it that way. As I started my degrees in history, and here I am talking to everyone about cybersecurity policy. As well as we have lots of other things to do. You know, there are a lot of work that there's a lot of work going on. There are a lot of listservs out there to be signed up on. I'm signed up on about 8 of them. I'm sure there are many, 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 many more out there. And 8 is about the limit that I can handle during a given day. As part of that, as a PUC moves into opening a proceeding or have a GRC, it's really important that the technical experts can participate. Our rules are really only as good as the people who participate. So if you see a rule coming out of the commission that you think is flawed in some manner, get involved with the state commission. We really need the support and expertise of the private industry out there that knows what's going on, that can inform the commission and their staff about what are best practices, what are some considerations they should consider. PUCs need to be understanding how do we value something that didn't happen. I talked about the last slide. And that becomes very difficult as we think about rate recovery for the utilities, is how do we measure what is the right amount of money. The regulatory construct related to pace of technological change. Again, the 3-year rate cycle doesn't really allow the utility. 3-year rate cycle as it's currently envisioned, is currently in practice, sets the framework for a 3+ year spending. And as these threats continue to evolve, having the utility have to come back repeatedly to the commission for more funding slows down the ability of the utility to respond to that. So allowing the utility to have a more flexible means to respond, I think, is something that PUCs need to get comfortable with. And then the rest of this is just sort of what ifs. It's a political response in essence. What happens when the cyber event happens and the grid comes down or a portion of the grid comes down? How does the PUC handle that political response? What is the acceptable level of risk? Again, as the PUCs start working with utilities to develop this risk-based management, we know that there's not 100% security. So what level of risk is our commissions willing to handle, knowing that when something happens, the PUC is going to be the one that are going to be hit at by the public? Where will federal government jurisdiction come down? This is still sort of this outstanding question hanging over at least state commissions' heads is as we start working on cybersecurity, because we have oversight and jurisdiction over the retail portions of the utilities, where will federal jurisdiction come down at? Where is the outline going to be? Are they going to extend it past 100 kV all the way down to the distribution grid, or are we going to maintain this historical level of 100 kV? As part of that, coordination with other agencies and the federal government becomes very important on this, because we have the same high-level goal of making sure the grid is reliable and secure, but we have different goals at the bottom. We want to make sure that it's provided at a reasonable cost. And the federal government, if they mandate standard, the cost consideration just goes out the window, and customers are then borne with that cost through their rates. Access to classified materials in federal briefings. This has sort of been a pet peeve of mine for some time now, is that there is a lot of classified information sharing going on that the PUCs are usually not the first state agency that they're contacted about this. For an example, in California, it's usually going through the State of California Chief Information Officer's office. That may seem reasonable, but PUC is the one with jurisdiction over the electric grid, and we are usually not called into these meetings, nor is it likely that PUCs have anyone with security clearance to participate. And this interaction needs to start happening between the federal government and the state government and the state PUCs to start sharing information better and allowing staff to get more involved in these security briefings. And the last issue, which I think overwhelms a lot of discussion, is a reluctance to share information, not only with the commissions, but amongst each other. And this is important because as threats evolve and change, I suspect that someone has seen it. And that information needs to be shared and disseminated across a wider audience so that a coordinated response to it can happen. As I'm thinking about the RuggedCon cyber event, that was sat upon by someone for a year or so before it was made publicly available, before it was publicly spread. And that's a long time that a severe risk to the utilities was just sitting out there. That time could have been used more effectively to address it. So utilities and vendors need to start sharing this information between each other and be able to express a little bit more publicly and more widely available. Additionally, utilities should be allowed to share info with the regulatory body without fear of liability. One of the very first hearings we had on cybersecurity, we were talking about discussing metrics. And some of the metrics the staff initially proposed were, how many outages a year do you have that's attributable to cyber events? How many annual cyber attacks do you have? I consider these very high level. And at the time, the utilities said, we can't tell you that. We don't want that made publicly available. So this is just one of those challenges that are still sitting out there around the interaction between the utility and the regulatory body that I think needs to start having. These issues need to be overcome because it's in the best interest of both entities that information is allowed to flow between them. And part of that is, my opinion, with the implementation of safe harbor rules so that utilities can share information without fear of liability coming down upon them by the regulatory body. As part of that safe harbor and encouraging the sharing of information, state commissions need to start having the ability to withhold data from public release through FOIA or Public Record Act requests. That is also one of the limiting factors on having utilities share information with PUCs is the current statutes aren't very clear on what we can withhold from public release that should be withheld from public release. There is a model out there that FERC has for a critical energy infrastructure designation that withholds data from FOIA requests. That all being said, I think we all would like some publicly available information. And that would be through the development of metrics, which hopefully the PUC will really start tackling either later this year or beginning of next year, because I've been promising that for several years now.
Chris, let's have a look from the audience to see if they're having any issues or before we continue. Okay, it says, please define acronyms. Voice was a little muffled. Hackers don't have checklists. Okay. All right, very good.
I'll try to speak more clear.
Yes, and a little closer to the microphone.
So, with all that going on, the PUC last September issued a white paper that investigated the current landscape around cybersecurity, what's going on at the federal level, what do we know going on in the utilities, and proposed several options for the Commission to move forward on. We proposed that the Commission consider opening a rulemaking so that to guide PUC actions on cybersecurity for the investor-owned utility. That the Cybersecurity Framework should be based on a risk-based model, that we should develop a means to evaluate utility investments in cybersecurity because, as stated, without knowing what they're investing in or how well that money is being spent, we don't really have a good handle on what is the appropriate amount of money to be spent. Another important thing that the paper identified was developing a protocol for the utilities to report cybersecurity incidents and information sharing regarding breaches and other incidents. And then the next two are what I've talked about previously about information sharing and safe harbor practices. And the last one is developing a process for the periodic reporting of security tests and audits. And I know that can be tricky for utilities to share, and that is really one of the things we want to have a greater understanding of as we move forward on our policy development is what is the utility strategy, what is the results of any testing or auditing that's been done, so that as our policy development moves forward, we have a greater understanding of what sort of challenges the utilities are facing. And then here's a quote about what the PUC's responsibility is in ensuring a safe and reliable electric grid. So the next steps that we are considering right now is the development of an OIR that would explore cybersecurity framework as how it can be applicable to other industries such as natural gas and water. To an extent, all three industries face the same type of challenges around legacy and advanced technology, IT versus ICS, need to protect information technology versus industrial control systems, the need to protect infrastructure, and the need to provide for essential services. Indeed, without electricity, how does water get flowing? How does water get pumped? And without water, how do power plants cool down? So there is a natural linkage between these three industries as it affects cybersecurity. The identification of standards is something we still want to consider, and whether the PUC should adopt any is a question to be answered later, as well as the identification and adoption of metrics. That's going to be a really important thing for us to handle, and it probably won't be easy as we have to balance the need to protect sensitive information with making more information available publicly. As part of this risk-based approach to cybersecurity, another thing we really want to focus on is creating a culture of security inside the utility. As I noted earlier, the #1 cybersecurity risk to a utility is still phishing expeditions. And having a culture of security imbued inside the utility will hopefully address and minimize many of these phishing risks. And the last one is vendors. And I hear this a lot from my utilities, is that the risk on their supply chain is borne by the utility, and the utilities would like to see it more borne by the vendors themselves, so that as the utility issues an RFP, they can say vendors must do A, B, C, and D, and must have some security requirements, cybersecurity certification up front, so that the vendors can build to that specification instead of the utility handling it in the back office. So part of this is shifting the responsibility to vendors to meet some cybersecurity requirements, to take the load off and take a lot of the work away from the utilities and create a more market and competitive process for this issue. And I know that there's some ongoing standards work devoted to developing a certification program for vendors. Here is a couple of examples of what's going on in other states. Like I said, there's work going on in other states. Surprisingly, California is not the first one I'm working on this. The Missouri Public Service Commission last July opened their own rulemaking on cybersecurity to understand what is going on with their utilities. They asked a total of 47 questions, and the responses and all subsequent reports have been filed under seal. So, good for the utilities and good for the commissions to be interacting. But I know I would like to know what's in there. The Texas Public Utility Commission last November issued a really well-done paper on cybersecurity in the state of Texas, and here's a link to the report. It's really well done, and I would encourage anyone to read it if you haven't yet. And there's been several actions going on in the Mid-Atlantic states. Pennsylvania PUC has actually been addressing cybersecurity for several years now. Utilities in Pennsylvania are required to maintain cybersecurity continuity plans, and the PUC staff must have access to them. And the Pennsylvania PUC staff actively engages the utilities to review those practices. In addition, there is an emerging joint effort amongst the commissions in Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware, District of Columbia, and New Jersey to develop a joint regulatory effort to coordinate actions and outreach to utilities on cybersecurity, to develop this joint regional plan. And it not only includes the regulated utilities, but includes cooperatives, municipals, the RTOs, regional transmission operators, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as well as natural gas and water utilities. I think that's probably going to be, that could be a very useful exercise to, again, coordinate and allow for some sharing of information to happen across multi-state utilities, especially considering that they are all under PJM and they all are so integrated with one another. Okay, take a breath. This is the break now between cybersecurity and privacy. So I just want to have some concluding thoughts on privacy or on cybersecurity and moving it into security and how there are links between, but they are very different animals.
I just wanted to make note of the fact that all the public utility commissions that you listed in the slide above are on this educational series distribution and periodically register to watch these presentations.
Great. So just a couple of high-level things. Without security, grid can only be safe and reliable. Without privacy, your data can only be so secure. And so these are just some takeaways for you to think about. You know, the challenge for security is what is enough security that's also cost effective. The challenge for privacy is a little different. We have changing cultural norms around privacy. We all walk around, if we live in a big city, there are cameras watching us on our every move. We all have phones, and unless you've disabled your connections, phone companies know where you are. As part of that, on the electricity side, you know, in California, we have a $5+ billion investment in AMI that's collecting a lot of information, and we want to make use of that information to encourage policies across the state. So how do we encourage this innovation and open data sets while protecting customer privacy? And part of that comes with informed customers. And what does an informed customer mean? Well, it can mean they are aware, they can understand, or they have the ability to act. And I'm going to scooch through these first several slides because I'm sure many of you have already seen these. This is just a brief history of what we've done in our smart grid proceeding. The decisions of note for privacy is the July 29, 2011 decision, which adopts a privacy framework around customer privacy for your AMI data. And then the August 31st, 2012 decision adopts the same rules for natural gas data. California has a long history of privacy. It's embedded in the California State Constitution. Article 1, Section 1 includes the right to privacy. Everyone has the right to privacy. In 2010, Governor Schwarzenegger signed Senate Bill 1476, which puts into the statutes privacy protections for customer data as it applies to utilities and utility contractors. It sets up a framework of primary purpose versus secondary purpose. Primary purpose is basically basic utility operations, utility contractors, and utility actions for system grid or operational needs, or the implementation of the DR energy management or energy efficiency programs. Primary purpose does not require customer consent. Everything else is considered a secondary purpose and requires customer consent. So here's a slide on the rules that are based on the Fair Information Practice Principles. Our rules apply to utilities, utility contractors, and third parties that obtain data from the utilities. That third part is going to be enforced via utility tariffs, and I'll get into that in a minute because this impacts green button implementation. The neat thing about this process is that it was consensus. There was not a lot of acrimony amongst the parties. The utilities worked hand in hand with the privacy advocates to develop these rules. And I think it was really beneficial to everyone. There was a lot of information going on. There's a lot of knowledge sharing amongst all the groups, and I think developed a really good set of rules. The goal of these rules are both to protect privacy, but also to enable customers to allow someone else to access their data, to encourage innovation, as well as to meet the policies of the state. As we think about customer access, third-party access to customer data, the Commission has been working on this for several years, and this is just simply in the smart grid context. We have a very long history of energy efficiency and DR and demerit programs that all rely on customer access, on third-party access to data. So this really isn't anything new, other than we didn't quite meet the goals stated at the bottom of the page. But we did direct the utilities in our privacy decision to do a number of things about making data more available to third parties. And the only one I'll really note, I'll note two things here. One is that we direct the utilities to allow third-party access via the utility, from the utilities, we call it backhaul when authorized by a customer, making use of a standard such as OpenADE. The second one is we directed the utilities to begin allowing access to the home area network. As I said, the customers have spent $5+ billion in AMI. Home area network was one of the key parts of the AMI investment, and directing utilities to make the home area network up and available really, we believe, would fulfill many of the goals outlined in utility AMI investment. While we were all doing this and making use of the OpenADE standard, the administration pushed forward with the green button program. And I'll just suffice to say that CPUC staff, namely me, have been involved in many of the efforts to develop the OpenADE standard through the NASB REQ 21 and 22 efforts, as well as work at Smart Grid Interoperability Panel, PAP 20. In October 2011, for those of you who live in California and are a customer of PG&E, Edison, or San Diego, you have the ability to download your data and give it to whoever you want to. Use your green button, download my data. So that is up and running for all 3 utilities as of January 2012. As we directed the utilities, there is an open proceeding on implementing what I'll call shorthand as green button connect my data. That is the more streamlined effort where a customer gives consent to a third party. That third party can connect directly with the utilities network and download the hourly data a day later at the same granularity as you would get it today if you did it on your own. Remember, the privacy rules do not apply to third parties that obtain it directly from the customer. So that's either through the download my data or eventually through the home area network. This is just a slide on where we are on implementing the OpenAD standard. There are a couple of issues, but the main issue holding us back right now is the issue of the utility liability. And the utility liability focuses on shutting off access to customer data by a third party. If the utility is aware that a third party is acting in violation of requirements, what is the utility's responsibility to the customer and to the rules around shutting off access to data? So the rhetorical question is, if the utility is aware of third-party actions in violation of privacy rules, but the third party has customer consent, is the utility acting recklessly by continuing to provide access? And that really is the crux of the issue right now in implementing the green button, protect my data. So these are just some implementation questions as people think about privacy and customer access for the green button is, how do you leverage these uses for things other than simple conservation? How do solar installers or energy efficiency providers or on-bill financing or demand response providers make use of this effort around green button that can make use of customer AMI data? What type of data is provided? Is it billing quality or is it unvalidated? Basically, how fast and what type of quality of data does a third party want? How much historical data we made available? In our proceeding, we have one utility that will make available 24 months worth of data, and 2 other utilities that are only going to make available 13 months of data. So these type of things need to be more consistent, which goes into making sure that consent forms across the 3 utilities are consistent. This is the last issue that there are only 2 more slides here. So the ongoing privacy issues are, we have an open proceeding in phase 3 about how do we handle research? How do we allow and encourage researchers to make use of AMI data in a way that protects customer privacy, but also can be used for innovative research projects? How do we define what is aggregated and anonymized? The law and the rules don't apply if data cannot be re-identified. So what is sufficiently aggregated and what is sufficiently anonymized? And we are in the middle of a working group effort to identify processes so that a third party or a research institution can go to the utility, make a request of the utility saying, I need X amount of information because I want to know how solar development may work in a particular area of the state. And that process is not consistent across 3 IUs. It's not very transparent across 3 IUs. So the hope is that by having the process laid out and eventually adopted by the Commission, that we have at least one set of rules that everyone can play by around accessing information that may have identifiable information in it. And part of it's just a growing pain. The rules have been in place for a little over for a year and a half now, almost 2 years, and now we're seeing what happens with implementation. We can have the best policies, and we all agree on the policies, but if they have problems in implementation, then that is probably the more valuable aspect of it, is how does it work in implementation? And so the final thought from a state commission perspective is, what about those not under direct PUC jurisdiction? Third parties that go directly to the utility. And there are a couple of efforts ongoing right now, and one of them is an ongoing effort by the Department of Energy to develop a voluntary code of conduct so that a third party or utility can agree to abide by a set of principles and put themselves, in essence, under Federal Trade Commission jurisdiction for any violation. And the last one is a pending bill before the State Commission called, before the State Legislature called AB 1274 that would apply to third parties that interact in the home area network world that obtain data directly from the meter. It would require third parties to have some pretty basic privacy rules, but then would also put them on the civil code and open for injunctive relief via the courts. If a third party is found in violation of these rules, they can take them to court, and the court can fine them between $100 to $5,000 for each violation as it deems proper. So I'm just putting it out there that there are areas of privacy that are still being worked on in the state and across the country, that as people think about developing business practices and models for privacy, that there are a lot of things still outstanding that through the implementation is what we eventually find out, such as the example of a third party not directly under PUC jurisdiction. So there's my name, how to contact me. There's a link to the PUC white paper. And I forgot to mention this last document. So NARUC, I'll just take 30 more seconds here. So NARUC, which is the trade organization for state commissions, has been doing a lot of outreach with state commission staff, and they developed a cybersecurity for state regulators white paper, as well as some associated questions that a commission consider asking their utilities. So if you're interested in understanding what a state commission may be thinking about, what suggestions they're getting, I would look to the NARUC cybersecurity effort as well. And with that, I will hand it back to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris. And at this time, we'll look at the questions. Several of them came online. And I will read the question and give Chris an opportunity to respond. I can see several questions here. Wow.
Holy.
We are doing very well. Are others having audio? Okay. Okay. We have a lot of information. I see.
Thank you, everyone, for being so patient.
Yes. All right. So I think we were right about here and start here. So would it be possible to provide a web link so we resolve that issue, because it's in the presentation and you'll all get a copy of that. The next question is, utilities are notorious for only sharing security/audit information if required through regulatory compliance. Any comments on that?
I would agree with that, and that's one of the hopes that we can get out of this future cybersecurity effort, is to allow for the information and trust between the utilities and the regulatory staff around the sharing of this information through safe harbors or liability restrictions, so that the PUCs can develop better policies without having any enforcement actions over the utilities. I think the trust and enforcement risks are two of the things that are really withholding or limiting this ability to interact between commissions and utilities. And once those issues get worked out, I would hope that the utilities and state commission staff would be able to work through these issues and start working together, because they do have the same issues, they have the same goals, and will both get hit by the public if something happens.
And the person who asked this question has based his opinion in working in a senior position in IT risk and technology security and privacy. So he speaks from experience. All right. Next question is, voluntary disclosure will not work, he says. Any comment on that?
I do not have a comment. That may be true, and this really all does go down to the utilities and the state commissions being partners in ensuring that the grid is safe, reliable, and secure, and that if voluntary disclosure and allowing access to data information by the state commissions is not sufficient, then the commissions have it fully within their power to direct more sharing if they need to.
One, I would say, chronic issue across the utility industry is that the cybersecurity staff is limited and their requirements on them are very many. So they're impacted. And because they're impacted, anything voluntary is put in a different priority list than anything that's compliant that has a financial implication. So in that sense, I think that's one of the reasons why voluntary would be hard from a resource perspective. All right, next is NERC tried voluntary compliance before finalizing NERC SIP. Didn't work for NERC.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the idea isn't voluntary compliance. The idea is to give the utilities the support to implement a more risk-based approach, a risk-based management approach to cybersecurity in conjunction with state commissions. So it's not about compliance or mandatory standards. It's about developing a common framework, in other words, building the four corners of the house and allowing the utility to maintain the four corners of the house and do things inside of the house that it needs to make sure the structure of the house stays standing up.
And one other advantage in that is that because different utilities have different budgets, by having these recommendations and best practices available, it helps mitigate some of the financial problems. And moving along, Pat Duggan asked, if we're not allowed to prevent sales of flats, disks, or other documents that detail gas pipeline and transmission line routing, which in effect also show substation locations, how can we be sure any other security information, including cybersecurity, will be kept secure?
I think I just have to go to, there's a number of things to that. One is, again, the trust level between the utility and the staff. And that can really only be developed on a one-on-one basis between staff and utilities. The second one would be potentially fines or penalties upon either the utility or potentially the PUC itself for the inadvertent, the willful release of information in violation of existing state law. But those are the only thoughts I have on that.
Moving along. Next question is, okay, Mike Rogers is asking you to contact him at your leisure. And then Janice Beecher talks about audio difficulties. And then Sandeep says, will we get a PDF copy of the presentation? Yes, you will. Mike Shea says, State of New York required smart and secure, of course, microgrids in the infrastructure after Hurricane Sandy. Would CPUC agree with New York's approach or pick a different approach?
I don't think we have a policy right now as it applies to microgrids. I know that many utilities in the state are investigating microgrids. There are a lot of locations that are investigating microgrids. I'm thinking several military bases, Air Force fields, and a couple of universities are considering microgrids for many of these same reasons, to make their source of power more reliable. What the Commission has focused so far on is supporting the growth of storage and other distributed generation technologies, so that the generation supply is more localized and are distributed, as opposed to the central generators that have historically ruled most utility procurement practices. So I wouldn't say we would pick a different approach. I don't know that we have any sort of policy right now that's devoted to meeting an issue like Hurricane Sandy and future infrastructure planning.
So in the initial stages, when microgrids were associated more with like campuses and commercial buildings and universities or military bases, I think one new direction that microgrids can take to help increase the resiliency by creating these voluntary islands during unstable times that may have a mix of renewable energy, some storage, and some load, so that they can remain self-sufficient for a period of time until the bulk transmission is restored. That is a new area, and it has cybersecurity implications in the sense that if you have a set of microgrids and you exchange information on a need-to-know basis, it creates some natural security, as opposed to having one central plant that if it got compromised, then that would compromise everything below.
Well, one of the other issues associated with microgrids, and it's an ongoing issue, an open proceeding at the PUC, is updating our interconnection standards. It's called our Rule 21, so that distributed generation, that's redundant, I know, can interact with the distribution grid more efficiently and effectively at locations where it can be useful to the reliability of the grid. And that's a still open and ongoing proceeding that I think will also go forward to supporting the more distributed nature of the grid.
Great. So at this time, I would like to ask Mike Amati to ask some questions. He has been sitting here very patiently listening to this discussion, and his eyes suggest that the plots are getting deeper and the topics are getting wider. So Mike, before it gets too elaborate.
Yeah, it's really appropriate that we're actually sitting in the conference room at TUV, who makes their living testing things. And it's interesting when you look on, you can't see this, but if you look on the wall, they show a lot of things they test. For example, the testing for the automotive industry. And they test things where you can't even sell them on the market unless they pass, right? Here we are, I don't know how many years later now, we've known each other, Chris, for 4 years now, and we still don't have any requirements for testing with vendors for security. We have organizations that can do it. They do it globally. Why doesn't the Public Utility Commission say, you got to do it?
Why? Because we have to have a proceeding to develop the record, to take comments on it, and to formulate an opinion and develop a policy.
Let's do it.
Well, that's one of the hopes out of the white paper, is to develop and open a rulemaking where that would be a topic for consideration.
Right.
So one of the things about TUV Rhineland is that they're involved in many verticals that are quite mature. So when I say mature, that means there's a large install base and the technologies are well developed and there is a purpose and there's a set of standards that are followed in those verticals, whether it's transportation or in food manufacturing and other areas. So that's why TUV is very deeply entrenched in those other verticals of certification. I would say that smart grid is still in its nascent period, and there are very elaborate standards and certification testing for more of the legacy type systems. But the challenge is that so much emphasis was put on implementation that the testing and certification part has lagged. And there is a little bit of a reverse scientific method at work here. And so we may have to make some corrections going forward, some awkward technology swaps that we'll have to make when we realize the vulnerabilities that will come out of certain certifications. So I'm glad that Mike brought this up, because what he's trying to do is avert a larger issue that would require much more money down the road if we don't take care of it now. Gary, Gary Sorkin from TUV Rhineland has a comment.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Irfan. Chris, would you be kind enough to go back to your slide number 9 for a moment? My comment comes from the quote that you have on the bottom of that slide. Yeah, and if I'll read it. The CPUC has a responsibility to ensure the safety and reliability of the grid down to the meter. One second. Thank you. And to ensure that utilities are prepared for the challenge of grid modernization as it occurs beyond their control. The CPUC also has a responsibility to ensure that ratepayers' dollars are being invested effectively in cybersecurity. Now, I'd like to address that and ask you a question, because, you know, looking around the room here, I see executives from the solar industry, cybersecurity people, IOUs, and of course our colleagues here. But we work with all of the IOUs, and instead of duplicating or triplicating the investment, we could work with you folks, and you could then disseminate the information to the entire California utilities which are under your jurisdiction. So in essence, you could buy it once and then share the information. So what do you have in mind for working with test labs, in particular TUV in this case? Thank you.
That is a great question. So the PUC, I'll give you an example of what we're doing right now, and this is in regards to home area network. So what we've done with home area networks is we've encouraged the utilities to coordinate their testing and certification practices and requirements for home area network devices to the extent that there are the same across the utilities. With the hope being that as these requirements become the same and is disseminated widely across the market, we can have a big batch of things out there that meet a framework. And then as they then go to each utility will have their own unique attributes that will impact how those devices work in their territory. So what we've done is encourage the utilities to do that and encourage the utilities to work with other certifying entities that can go out and certify, in this case, Zigbee devices. So that certifying entity would work, entities would work with the utility requirements with the idea that all testing certification would be moved from the utilities and a certification could be made for California or the West for these devices. Now, it's not going to happen very fast because utilities quite rightly want to maintain control over the network, but the commission staff has been pretty focused on having a wider set of requirements that developers and manufacturers can meet for the state, and then allowing just a small bit to happen now at the utility. It's not been our position, I believe I can say it that way, to specify a particular testing certification vendor. It's been more around specifying the requirements, in this instance, the cybersecurity and testing requirements for devices, so that then third-party certification entities can go out and develop a process to test and certify devices that fit within the requirements of the PUC. And hopefully through that interaction with us, with utilities, and eventually certification entities, we can develop a joint process so that the utilities and the certifying entities can work together to streamline this process so we can get more vendors, more devices out in the market for customers. I don't know if that quite gets what you were hoping for, but that's basically what we've been focused on so far.
Well, in essence, you're kicking the can down the road, creating programs that will then manifest itself into a procedure, and there's nothing that is in the focused future that could actually solve the problems of being hacked. Today's San Jose Mercury News on page A5 talks about our weapon systems being compromised by the Chinese government. So while we're taking cybersecurity seriously, we're making very little proactive, concrete moves in that direction. And I feel that the bureaucratic element of a larger institution such as your PUC, as well as how the other PUCs in the country look upon you as a leader, is actually doing a disservice, because it's, while every day nothing happens, we think of that as a victory. However, we are very vulnerable, and we need to address this, I think, a lot more ardently than we have.
I won't disagree with that statement. Since this is a regulatory process, we need to have a record to develop it in order to make policies like that, so that we can set requirements, minimum requirements around cybersecurity for devices that get purchased by utilities or made available in the marketplace.
Is there an upcoming meeting which might be appropriate for us to speak at?
I think the best option at this point would be to, I mean, we can continue meeting, but as far as the record, one of the things that we're hoping to get out, hopefully by the fall, is a rulemaking where issues like that can be raised.
Thank you.
We have a question from Manny from Codenomicon.
Hi, Chris, thanks for your presentation. I guess a question I have is with the home area network, learning from the mistakes of Wi-Fi in the early days, WEP was enabled and easily cracked. Now that you guys have regulation, I guess, down in the meter, but you have an interface that's able to communicate in someone's home, and there's all these devices now that are able to bridge and to Ethernet and other things like that. Does the CPUC see any responsibility with that, having that interface and testing and make sure that that protocol that's being used is actually secure and doesn't open any holes for privacy leaks and other concerns like that, much less the physical attacks that are already out there, like the optical connection on the meters as well, where people can spend $400 and now they can directly communicate with these devices.
The short answer is our jurisdiction stops at the meter. So in essence, what the customer does inside their house is up to the customer and what they decide they want their risk tolerance to be. No different than someone implementing a Wi-Fi router and leaving their security off. If the customer wants to do that, the customer can do that. Our requirements are the utilities to maintain that their network is secure. That is the general statement to utilities, is that their network must be secure, and they can do, at this point, what is needed to maintain the security of their network. As it applies to optical ports, I can't really speak to anything like that. I don't believe, I may be wrong, so I don't want to give bad information here, but I don't believe our utilities have that option.
If we could demonstrate, for example, on with our tools on major vendors' products, the capability for, let's say there was a zero-day vulnerability, how would the CPUC deal with that?
At this point, that interaction would be with the utility. Since we don't have policies or procedures in place right now regarding such a thing like that, to the best of my knowledge, what we would do with that information is we would ask the utility.
So it's not in your jurisdiction to do any audits or any security checking on their networks?
That's one of the things we're hoping to implement policies to do.
We'd be happy to work with you guys and show you, how we can help you there.
Yeah, we've been talking about that for years.
So we know the utilities are doing that, and our rules, our policies give the PUC staff the ability to go and review the audits. So we have access to them, but as I stated before, one of the challenges we have is staffing. That we have a lack of staffing and a lack of the technical expertise to really understand all that. So one of the things that we did in the PG&E GRC is hire a consultant to go and in essence do the auditing for commission staff and then to report back to commission.
Okay, we have 15 minutes left, and I really want to get through these questions. So, Matthias, you have a quick question from TUV.
Yeah.
Or a comment.
Yeah, of course. We appreciate the effort that the CPUC is making, and I also appreciate the fact that these things will take time. I just had a comment regarding the jurisdiction of the CPUC and the effect it has on these issues of cybersecurity. I believe that with the distributed generation that now happens on private premises via inverter, and we are very much involved with the inverters on our side, these issues are not comparable to those of a Wi-Fi router in a house. Why? Because the effect that these devices have, they extend far into the network, and they cannot separate it from effects that are happening at central generators. That is the whole point of a distributed generation, and that is that distributed generation needs to be just as secure on-premise as it needs to be at the central generator. And we are desperately looking for guidelines and secure rules so that we can implement our work in mediating that kind of security, privacy, and interoperability. So that was just a comment.
Yeah, so the lines are kind of blurred here between a customer prem and an independent power producer that has similar technology.
Right, and again, part of the responsibility of the utility is to make sure their network and their grid is secure, and there are standards that the Commission has relied on for those things, such as what's going on in our Rule 21 proceeding, as well as the ongoing debate between DNP 3 and 61850, which provides the most secure standard which provides the most secure standard by which a distributed generating entity can interconnect with the utility. So by using the use of the standards, as well as some high-level requirements, is what the PUC is focusing on as it regards the interaction with the distributed generation.
So here is an example. I mean, this is a more detailed technical discussion that we need to have on cybersecurity, because you're dealing with multiple layers in the logical stack. And while these protocols like DNP and 61850 hit the upper layers and have security controls there are network layer and PIMAC layer issues that also need to be addressed if we want to do an all hazards approach for security. So this is a more detailed discussion. I want to appreciate the policy and that end of it for this discussion. So we'll move along, but we will make a mental note that we'll have a more detailed presentation to talk about how do you secure field equipment in distributed energy resources. This is a hard field, and I know Francis Cleveland is on the call, and Francis has been working tirelessly with the PAP and NIST to come up with distributed energy resource object model, not just for representing the attributes of the distributed energy resource, but also put in the security controls in 62351, the IEC standard. All right, moving along, we have a question from Michael Shea. Would CPUC, let's see, I think I went a little too far. Would CPUC lead the effort of defining what it would need to secure the grid in light of the existence of microgrids and PPA? And I think you've kind of addressed that you're not quite there yet.
We're not quite there. I mean, we'd be interested in working and supporting any effort, but I don't know if we are ready yet to lead that effort entirely.
All right. The next question is, would Google and Microsoft, for example, type of company ever be allowed to access the meter data in a machine-readable only format via HAN, for example?
If Google or Microsoft or some other online company has for the time being, a piece of technology that can be installed or made available to the customer on the customer side of the meter that can communicate with the meter via Zigbee, that is the future. I mean, that is what we are hoping to have, is that any third party that a customer chooses to sign up with that can access the HAN via Zigbee, that would be allowed to happen. If we're talking about not connecting directly to the meter and by using some other gateway that customers already installed, again, that would be something we would hope that the market would handle, and that is where we see the things hopefully moving forward over the next several years.
Yeah.
So yes.
Key thing to focus here is that the Public Utility Commission is interested in securing the utility network. That means that their interest in home area network is only so far as that it doesn't become the launch pad for attacks on the AMI network. And there are some security controls on the meter that have been defined, and the various major IOUs in California are following those. All right, next question is, has the California Public Utility Commission issued any final orders in which evaluations regarding appropriateness of costs associated with cybersecurity have been determined?
The PUC has, over the past several years, in decisions focusing on the utility general rate cases, has issued decisions on budgeting for utility cybersecurity programs. I won't go into an opinion on whether those are appropriate or not, but the Commission has issued decisions on how much money a utility can spend for cybersecurity, and it's been happening for several years now. Most recently, so earlier this year, we had a decision for San Diego Gas and Electric, as well as one for Southern California Edison, and both of them have approved some funding, albeit not what the utilities requested, but has approved some funding for cybersecurity, and you can read the decisions or contact me, I can send you the links to them, and I'll leave it up to you to determine if we did a good job, if the ALJ and the commissioner did a good job on evaluating them.
One of the challenges in risk assessment is you can estimate the impact if an attack occurs, but measuring the probability that an attack occurs, that's a very, very difficult science. And this makes it very difficult to do risk assessment because it's the product of the impact and the probability that the impact will occur that then justifies how much you want to spend on cybersecurity. So several organizations just say, oh, it'll happen. The probability is 1. Now deal with it. How much are you willing to invest to protect? All right, next question from Tom Tansey says, if security requirements stop at meter, how does this affect DG beyond the meter? And so this was Matthias's point.
What I'll just say about that is that from a PUC jurisdiction perspective, that is our jurisdiction, is basically to the meter. So how the market on the other side of the meter progresses, what standards are put into place on that side, to an extent is not necessarily up to us, because our requirements are the utility to maintain that the utility meter and the utility grid is maintained and secure. Now, as things get rolled out through inverters and reliance on standards, we want to make sure that distributed generation that is installed, we're aware of the standards being developed so that make use of distributed generation. But I can't say today how that. I lost my train of thought. I mean, we are concerned that things that the customer puts in their meter is secure, but we have, in my opinion, limited jurisdiction to impact or direct the direction of a particular standard.
Okay, quick point from Matthias, and we need to move on.
Yeah, so just quickly, the CEC has the incentive programs. The CEC has these incentive programs where they direct inverter makers, for example, to apply certain rules, and these could be made part of it. This just as a way to implement these kind of measures.
So you're right. The CEC may have the ability to do that through their standard development, through their directions to standards.
Question from David Chambers of the CEC. Do you see opportunity for state-sponsored cyber infrastructure security research, development, and demonstration should state R&D employee obtain security clearance?
I think there's plenty of opportunity for any number of entities out there to do research and development on cyber infrastructure. The Commission earlier this year issued a decision approving a new research lab at Livermore National Lab, and one of the directions is to do cybersecurity research and demonstration projects. And so that's just an example. The Commission is supported for more R&D to go forward from a state perspective. And as should R&D employees obtain security clearances, I don't know. I've been told different things about whether security clearance would be helpful or not helpful to me. I think it just has to be up to the need and whether there's a need to obtain security clearance.
Next question is, how is the PUC starting to look at EVs in regard to security, multiple locations, connections, providers, grid services, and the future of V2G privacy security?
So the way that PUC is viewing EVs right now is, first of all, charging facilities cannot be owned by the utility. So in essence, we have the same DG issue since the utility is not the owner of the electric vehicle charging facility. So again, what we are relying on is the use of standards to support the development of electric vehicles, and then allowing the utility or directing the utility to maintain the security of their grid across the grid, regardless of whether there's an EV there or not. So, for example, we're supportive of the various SEE standards, and we know that Zigbee is the preferred standard in that SEE standard for internet for connections with the car as well as with the meter from the charging facility. But for the most part, it is at this point upon the utility to maintain the security of their grid and their network, both from an EV perspective as well as a DG perspective, relying on standards as well as relying on development of standards.
Next question from Dave Chambers is, would the testing of vendors' technology give a false sense of security if the technology's component supply chain is not vetted? If not, why not?
I guess that's really no different than any other format that the utilities are doing right now around testing and certification of technology. You know, I've heard jokes that, you know, how you can tell when a Cisco device is not real because it looks better than the real Cisco device. But, you know, I think that's just, you know, the normal course of events is making sure that the supply chain is that people are aware the supply chain issues remain regardless of the technology component, and testing certification is just one way to meet some of these challenges.
The next question, you've kind of addressed it already because you're saying that your jurisdiction is not so much on the HAN as it is on the utility network. But it says, every so often my car will be required by the state to go through the emission test. So when would each and every HAN throughout California be required to pass an emission, physical and logical alike, test to ensure that these HANs are indeed rationally behaving citizens of the state? Wide, smart. This is kind of like corporations are people. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, we don't. So we haven't reached there yet because there is not a lot of devices out there right now. So basically, we're just relying on the coordination between the utility and the meter vendor and their HAN network provider if it's different, so that as new firmware needs to be installed in the meter to support the home area network, that whatever the customer has on their side of the meter can continue working with whatever new firmware. You know, there's a process that's been developed in PAT 18 for how that should happen. We haven't necessarily adopted it, but that is something that we are continuing working on in our home area network process, is not only developing to hopefully that these testing certification requirements will outline how often, if any, a device needs to be updated or not. I mean, I think of myself as, I think of something that happened to me a couple years ago where I had an iPod, and I put a new firmware on my Mac, and my iPod wouldn't work anymore because it's too old. So I had to go get a new iPod. You know, I think these type of things just happen naturally every couple of years. That something will just be required of the customer. That may not be very nice to people to think that a customer will do this, but the way technology has been working is these are just natural attributes in the natural cycle of things. Is every couple of years, something new is going to have to be required.
And there was a very good presentation by Mike Borton last time in which he spoke about the different architectures that are possible going forward in home area networks, including one where it's a utility-focused HAN that may be all SCP-1. It may be a hybrid one where it's 1 with the utility and then 2.0 on the customer side. Or if the meter can be upgraded to 2.0, you could have a pure 2.0 or a meter one that's 2.0 with a little 1.0. So all kinds of permutations are possible. And I think anyone who's been in IT knows that protocols like X.25 coexisted with IP for a while, and then X.25 disappeared. We saw that with IPX, with their data, file management, that we held on to that because Microsoft didn't have a good file management system. And then when they had it, IPX was taken away, and it became pure IP. So we have plenty of examples throughout our IT history to show that these processes are gradual, as Chris defined. Okay. Next question or comment from Mike Rogers is, agree with the speaker, we need to move forward. There has been way too much discussion with very little action. Most security practitioners know the issues, both in terms of impact and likelihood. Is this just an education issue for informing and educating the business decision makers? Are we talking about the reason for this presentation?
Yes, I think I would personally, my personal opinion is I would agree with that. It is one of these challenges, as I tried to explain earlier, between this pace of change that is required and increasingly required upon the utilities versus a regulatory structure and process that does not move very fast. And so what our challenge is not necessarily to react to everything out there, but allow for a process where the Commission or the utilities have a means by which to act accordingly in a timely manner. And I think that is what we were trying to get at in our white paper, and if we open up an OIR in the future, is how that process works so that the utilities are in a position where they can act appropriately and efficiently.
Mike, the purpose of presenting it here in this forum is that this forum brings in people from different stakeholder groups. So while this information is described in IEEE conferences and SGIP type conferences, but the stakeholder groups that are represented a lot of times is a little limited. We have in this educational series some 2,300 people in 10 countries that may not sit necessarily in a lot of those. So that's why there is an element of redundancy here, but we feel that by presenting like this and having more people look at it, reflect on it, we'll get better answers for our questions. Tom Tansey says, does the CPUC know about what the utilities are proposing with respect to distributed generation? They're talking about direct control of the assets on the homeowners' roofs. Seems at odds with CPUC policy.
So I personally am only aware of a handful of things about this, and I'll only talk to, I can only address what I'm aware of. It's not surprising, in my opinion, that the utilities are seeking direct control of the assets. There's several reasons, and they may be good reasons for why they want to do that. But I'm hesitant to go much further than anything beyond that, simply because I'm not very well versed, especially in our Rule 21 proceeding, what's going on there. I could just say that my personal view of it is, you know, if a homeowner or if the distributed generation provider or owner is attempting to interact with the utility or enter a contract with the utility or provide other services, I think that's one thing. If it's a DG provider trying to offset their rate, that's a completely different thing. But that would just be my opinion, and feel free to reach out to me, and I can put you in touch with someone who's far more versed in this issue than I am.
There's another comment that's related to the idea that if you don't enforce it, it's not going to happen, as the example of SOX in the financial industry, so valid point there. Next is from Mike Shea, who says, how does CPUC differentiate a hand supporting a rooftop solar generation equipment and the IT network supporting a smart microgrid?
I don't understand that very much right now. What I'll say is that so the home area network that's communicating with the meter is the communication is supported and framed by the standard, by the, at this point in time, the Zigbee standard. So regardless of what is on the customer side, if it's communicating with Zigbee and the device is then certified and is sold in that utility territory using Zigbee, it can communicate with the meter. That is what my understanding is. Now, when we talk about HON, you know, most of us think about appliances and in-home displays and things inside the house. So that is you know, an area that I do need to remember that it's far more broader than just home appliances. Now, as far as the IT network supporting a smart microgrid, again, if the microgrid is outside of the utility control, then the interaction is just between the point where the microgrid connects to the utility. Things that happen beyond the utility, you know, I guess is really no different than what goes on behind the meter from, at least my perspective, from the Commission. It's just that interaction itself between the point of contact with the utility is where we are really focusing on, and where the utility has the responsibility to maintain their security of their grid and their network, you know, in support of available standards that are widely used and supported by the market.
Francis Cleveland says that I could answer many of the questions raised about the CPUC and Rule 21. I can tell people that they can contact me, and that is FCLEVE at Xanthus, XANTHUS -consulting.com. All right. Then I think we have reached the end of our questions. So at this point, what I'd like to do is thank Chris for a very informative presentation and very thorough responses. And remember, this was his opinion, and it no way represents the official positions of the California Public Utility Commission. Please keep that disclaimer in mind as you review these comments. I have to say that today's webinar was a very good example of what redundancy can do for you in order to have availability. We had a very nice Polycom digital telephone that works amazingly to make calls, but we were not able to connect to our webinar today, and was completely unpredictable because the last time we were here, it did connect. So had this cell phone not been here, we would not have had audio. And I have to thank Verizon and the 4G LTE, and I have to also thank Samsung for providing such a battery that allowed me, without an adapter, to have an hour-and-a-half presentation without a charge. So it is just amazing how hibernate mode with a speaker phone can last so long. So with that, I want to just let you know that our next presentation is going to be on June 18th. It's going to be a Tuesday from 11:30 to 2. I will send, or actually 12:30 to 2. I will send you details about the speaker and the content at that time. We will only have one webinar in June because of vacations and travel. It's not practical to have two. We're going to have very low attendance in June because of the kids in school and everyone taking off to better places. All right, so thank you again. And at this time, I'm going to end the recording and then invite you to come back on the 18th of June for our next presentation. Thank you and have a good afternoon.